sites from and settlements from this time. Broadly assigned to Thebes, this in part in the second text can be more explicitly provenanced, which I will get onto in a second. So Djeme is a site that is, so here on a map showing broadly the landscape of Thebes in the 7th and 8th centuries, a lot of the outlines of sites may be familiar to many people in the audience. Djeme I've highlighted. It's not quite a spoiler, but I'll be discussing this more. Djeme is the name of the village that occupied the mortuary temple of Rameses III, Medinet Habu. And so I'll be coming back to that momentarily. Other sites on this map, I'll be showing this map again lately. I don't expect anyone to remember all of the small numbers on the slide, but I'll be coming back to show different connections of people and groups of people that are illuminated by the two texts I'll be talking about this evening. And so in question of where was it written, the text on the back, as we saw, mentions Djeme. In a number of articles and books discussing the ostracon, Brown, who's interested in the solar eclipse, he only mentions Djeme in passing. Jerry Gilmore and John Ray, in their 2006 article, and I'll be coming back to this article quite a bit over the next however long please also stop me if I do go on, but I'll be coming back to their article a few times. They note the inscription records an eclipse of the sun on a specific day at a specific time and in a particular place, Djeme, Medinet Habu, on the west bank at Thebes. I'll be coming back to this. And then Terry Wilfong, in his book Women of Djeme, which I'll return to, isn't as explicit but refers to the text just for what it says, and that is in reference to a secular official of the village. And so Djeme is mentioned, but was it written there? I'm going to have that as a slight cliffhanger because I'll deal with it when we come to also who. And so in terms of who, going back to Gilmore and Ray's article, and the article is interesting for how it tries to, I guess, paint a story or tell a story around this piece, which is interesting, but also raises a number of issues, and I want to address a couple of issues which reflect maybe biases or presuppositions, especially of people working on earlier periods and attitudes towards this period of late antiquity. And so they note, we do not know why the scribe at Djeme, I question, at Djeme, made his record, but he clearly felt the need to surround the text with signs of the cross in an attempt to invoke divine protection. He may have been uneasy in view of the numerical pattern of an event which took place at the 4th hour on the 14th of Phamenoth in the 4th year of an indiction. And this is an interesting elaboration and I would say fiction on a point. So what he's referring to, I believe, and one question I will put here is I doubt that Gilmore and Ray actually saw this ostracon, so until 2013, no image of the front that mentions the solar eclipse had been published. And so most people who had discussed this were going purely off the print edition, and one of the things I'm most interested in is what we lose by just reading off the paper and not actually looking at the text, the object as an artifact itself. And so what they're referring to is this cross at the very beginning of the first line, and this one where the limestone gets a bit bumpier, it's a little bit wavy at the end. This is not for divine protection. This is a really common scribal habit of marking the beginning and ends of sections, sometimes lines. And so as one example from a papyrus I'll be discussing momentarily, here we see crosses at the beginning of the first line, the second line, 3 crosses here. They're used almost as, not quite as punctuation, but almost, they separate sections. This has nothing to do with divine protection. So how drawing upon maybe biased ideas about who the writer may have been can influence the way that you present the material. And that's one other case. And this does sound, now that it's picking on John Ray, it just so happens that there are 2 examples from his work. So in his 2007 book, The Rosetta Stone and the Rebirth of Ancient Egypt, he talks about this graffito on the left. Get my left and right mixed up. This image on the left, which is taken from the Theban Mapping Project website, is one of many, many graffiti written in the tomb of Rameses IV, KV2, tomb number 2 in the Valley of the Kings, which is located very close to the entrance to the valley, and it was reoccupied by a number of individuals around this time, 7th century or so, maybe slightly earlier as well. And it is full of Coptic, but also Greek graffiti in and around, literally in and around the original hieroglyphs and images from Rameses IV's tomb, and including here as well, these 2 pictures of monks, priests in the prayer pose, orient position, hands up. And talking about the large graffito here, Ray says, he tells us, this is the monk who wrote the graffito, he tells us how he was driven to cover up the inscriptions he could see around him because he was terrified of the power of the words they contained. He could not read them, but he knew that they were capable of taking over his thoughts and cutting him off from his God. An Egyptologist is the last thing this nervous monk would have wanted to be. Again, it's a nice story if you want to have a particular bias, but as Jennifer Westerfeld has most recently demonstrated in her book, shown here in the bottom right, Egyptian Hieroglyphs in the Late Antique Imagination, this shows a misunderstanding of not just what that text is referring to, but the nature of the other graffiti in the tomb as well, and how they connect together. And what we're seeing here is not monks scared and threatened by the images and the words that they see around them. This is not to say that this is not a theme that we see in other texts. The monk Shenouta, perhaps the most famous Egyptian monk, Coptic author, head of the monastic federation at Sohag of the White and Red monasteries. In some of his texts, he talks very pointedly about the threat, the danger posed by hieroglyphs, of the threat of idolatry, of animal sacrifice, animal worship and blood sacrifice. This is certainly a theme in a Christian period, but it's far too simplistic an approach to say that Christians living in this time were threatened by the remains of their ancient world. This is where they grew up. They saw this all the time. I find it very hard to imagine that everybody would be so threatened by this. But both this example by John Ray and the previous one with the ostracon give this idea of a particular painting of the kind of Christian individuals that inhabited Egypt at this time, and one that I think can be very easily dismissed. And so if we dismiss this idea of a nervous monk looking for divine protection and scared of the eclipse, who then wrote this ostracon? And this is work that is not mine, but this is work has already been done. So Chantal Houtel, who is one of the preeminent scholars talking about Coptic scribes, writers across Western Thebes, especially in various monastic communities, she has proposed, and I think very convincingly, that the author of this solar eclipse ostracon, based on the handwriting, remember it doesn't have a name on it, can be identified as a priest Mark, who happened to be priest of the Church of St. Mark. So we've got a couple of Marks flying around. And one example here is ostracon from the site, of which you see an image in the bottom on top of Gonat Mirai. And I think the hands are very similar. One of the powers of paleography, again, what is really needed from looking at these texts. And Mark is an individual quite well known. He wrote sites that have been found at other Theban sites, not just at this church of St. Mark, but also in a couple of small monastic communities at Sheikh Abdel Gurna. And I'll show this on the map momentarily. A Theban tomb 29, a New Kingdom tomb that was reoccupied by a couple of monks in the 7th and 8th century, and the so-called monastery of Epiphanius, located in and around Theban tomb 103, the tomb of a 11th dynasty vizier Dagi, of which we have excellent records. And before moving on, just for those who are maybe interested in knowing more about this corpus of texts, about the Topos of St. Mark, and about this individual Mark, just directly to the publication in 2015 of Anne Boudon and Chantal Hutel publishing this range of ostracon. But in terms of this is maybe a who, I won't go back to the question of where. So going back to this map, I've pointed, more or less, to 3 sites, Topos of St. Mark at the bottom of this map, and then in the middle, Theban tomb 29, and at the top, the monastery of Epiphanius, all sites that Mark has been connected with. And what I am proposing, and things are tentative at best, but possibilities of how we can maybe narrow down by pulling back from the actual text that's written and looking at the material, is it possible to narrow down or disclude any of these sites? And this comes from work that I've done looking at the material aspects of ostracon from Western Thebes. So this table is taken from an article study I published a couple of years ago, which is still a work in progress. This is a survey of just over 3,700 ostracon from the 7th and 8th centuries in Western Thebes from a number of the sites we see here. And looking in particular at a mix of regular pottery, limestone, and very, very rarely wood. There are a couple of issues with this. One, a lot of old publications especially don't mention the material. And they may mention pottery or limestone if you're lucky. With pottery, another interesting point is if it's written on contemporary pottery, or we have reused New Kingdom pottery as well for certain texts, for example. But a lot of this information hasn't been of interest to previous scholars. And one of the methodological issues here is that this is just where texts were found. This doesn't reflect possibly where they were written. However, I'd still argue that even with these issues involved, that the statistical bias shows that limestone ostracon are predominantly found at Deir el-Bakri. Deir el-Bakri is, I'm sure, a site familiar to nearly everyone, if not everyone, because of its New Kingdom history. I'll go into that in a moment. But statistically, it's the only site that has a dominant number, like most of its texts are written on limestone rather than pottery sherds. 2 other texts that have a decent number are the monastery of Epiphanius and Theban tomb 29. So these 2 sites here. Everywhere else is basically negligible. It's like, okay, cool, but one, what do we do with this information? Why is this even a thing? Why limestone in one place? And this goes back, so just briefly here, this is Deir el-Bakri, the monastery of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut from the 18th dynasty, a site, as you all probably know it. Less well known, typically, is the later history of this site, what it looked like in late antiquity. Because when Edward Neville excavated it in the late 19th century, 1895-96 season, I believe, on behalf of the Egypt Exploration then Fund, now Society, he did not care about the later remains. He was not interested in recording them, and the only reason we have these photographs, which today are in the collection, the archive of the EES, was because of very young Howard Carter, who has a big anniversary coming up later this year. But young Howard Carter was on site with Edward Neville and took photos of the site before what we see here on the upper terrace was demolished. And these remains are the remains of a monastery, the largest, potentially, or most likely the largest monastery in Western Thebes at this time. And we just get a glimpse The most dominant structure is this large mud brick tower built in the southeast of the upper terrace of Hatshepsut, which looks a far cry from what it does today. The monks who are living here, for some reason, primarily wrote on limestone, not on pottery. And the reason for that is actually, if we look next to it, the demolished temple of Tutmosis III, which wasn't demolished in recent times, but already in the 21st dynasty, probably by an earthquake. And what this did, was produce basically a quarry of not just limestone, and limestone by itself, right, is not going to be nice to work on, it's going to be rough, but of worked limestone that has smooth sides. Yes, it may be broken and fractured in weird places, but you have this repository, this abundance next to you of really nice writing material. And so, why limestone? It's convenient. It happens to be there. I'll return to the map later about maybe how kind of, not so much the fallout zone, but how this distributes. Before I get onto that, just to point out, so for those unfamiliar, so the monastery was founded by Apa Abraham, shown here on the left, or most likely him, who was Bishop of Armont to the south, and a vast body of entirely ostracon were written under his reign, largely concerning the management of his diocese. Appointment of priests, for example, dealing with other issues that come to him. We see a range of, a small example of texts from the monastery at the top. And for those of you particularly interested in learning more, Vladimir Skodlevsky's volume on Del Bakri, the Monastère de Saint-Foy-Beaumont, remains the main overview of it. And more recently, Esther Goel's study is of the testaments of various early heads of the monastery, which was published a few years ago by the FAO. And so, okay, why care about the material itself? Getting back to this point. And just to start, although I've put it at the bottom, going back to Gilmore and Ray, the fact that it was written on an ostracon rather than on the more formal medium papyrus may be significant. This modest inscription written quickly on a potsherd is an informal record rather than a liturgical or theological one. It is not part of an epitaph or a homily or an encomium of a saint. One, it's not a potsherd, it's limestone. Again, I think proof that they've not seen it or really thought about the material. I'd say this isn't written quickly. The hand is even, it's consistent. There doesn't seem to be any haste about it, and I'll return to this point soon. And also, ostraca, yes, they can be used almost like post-it notes or notebooks in some respects for lists, for notes, for memoranda, but also for legal documents, for important letters bearing important ecclesiastical appointments. Again, it's too simplistic to say that the medium is entirely reflective of what type of text is written on it. And so a couple of points I put here. Extra information not contained in the text. The fact that it's limestone, to me, suggests we can narrow down where it's written. Statistically, it suggests that it may have been written at Del Bakri. That's statistically the most likely. I'll come back. Does this then impact our understanding of Mark writing this? Was he present at the monastery? The date 601 places him as a direct contemporary of the Bishop Abraham. Was he traveling around? Was he there at some point? Maybe when the eclipse took place, I'll get back to that as well. And if it's not Mark, is it a similar hand, a point that has been raised for a long time as well in discussion of this? Or is it a rare example of limestone elsewhere? We know that Mark visited sites on, or texts written by him were found at Sheikh Abd al-Ghurna, and it seems like they, being close to the monastery, and I thought I had a map coming up soon, apparently I don't. We'll return to that soon, but Sheikh Abd al-Ghurna is close to Del Bakri as well, so if you're interested in writing on limestone, it's not that long to go and get a group of it and bring it back. And I think from this, what we can say, it's very unlikely he was at the Topos of St. Mark when he wrote it. And does it instead open up other opportunities for where he is? And one other opportunity I want to play slightly devil's advocate in this was actually questioning whether he saw the eclipse himself, whether this is a contemporary account or a later copy. And one thing I've been thinking about based on especially the drawing on the side, which is found on lots of writing exercises, how neat it is. Could this be either much later, like he found an ostracon which referred to it and he's writing it out, maybe it's a model. Maybe he did see the eclipse, maybe it's written later the day, maybe it's written later. And I just want to throw out those possibilities to show kind of how much room for maneuver there is in this and raising different questions which are founded on understanding the broader context of production and the kind of text that we have from the site. We have lots of writing exercises. Or maybe he did see it. But I just want to throw that out there to complicate points. But something moving on to firmer ground, and that's the back. And in the year when Petros, son of Palou, was the Shane, village headman of Djeme. So I've already mentioned that Djeme is Medinet Habu. And thank you to my colleague, Dr. Ashley Cook, who took this photo about a month ago while visiting down in Luxor, which I have his permission to steal for this PowerPoint. It's one of the nicest shots I've seen. But this is site as we know it today. And it, again, as with Deir al-Bakri, it has so much of its late antique remains stripped away. They're still there. And so briefly, before we segue into the next Turin document that I'll be looking at today, Medinet Habu, today restored primarily to what it looked like in the 20th dynasty, or more or less, was in the 7th and 8th centuries the largest village in western Thebes, with a population maybe conservatively of around 1,500, maybe 2,000 or a bit more people. Remains of the village survived until 100 years ago, until the 1920s, when the Oriental Institute of Chicago's epigraphic mission to the site removed the later remains, not just of this period, but also Roman remains and earlier as well, to strip back the site to its pharaonic past to record the epigraphy of Rameses III. Today, if you visit the site, and maybe if you visited the site, you wouldn't have noticed these points, but maybe next time you'll see them in fresh eyes. 100 years ago, the picture in the middle, we'll see this in the next slide bigger, shows what part of the site looked like. But today, the mud brick perimeter wall still has these remains of the houses from 1,300 years ago. It's much harder to remove them from the mud brick. Luckily, the mud brick doesn't have any inscriptions that would necessitate removing them, but we still have traces of these lives there, even if they're not recognized. The second courtyard of the temple was a church, the Holy Church of Djeme, which, again, in old photos from the late 19th century, you can see columns that used to fill the inside of the church, which would have had a wooden roof. And in old photos, you can see the postmarks or beam marks as beams filled this. And it would have gone above the temple itself to be this, like, the most important church in the village. Today, the remains of these smaller columns lie just to the south of the wall, gathering moss, but they're still there as these echoes of late antiquity. And so the Turin ostracon, incidental detail mentioning Djeme on the back, but it's the earliest certainly dated document that refers to the village. So we know it was inhabited by people writing Coptic, at least at the very early 7th century. How much before that? We know it was occupied in earlier periods, but whether there's a period of abandonment, we don't know. The town is extraordinarily well documented, and I'll move on to Rome very, very shortly, an example from Turin's collection from the site. The vast majority of texts from the village postdate the Arab conquest of 642 AD. Most of them are from the first half of the 8th century. We have a really important group of papyri that I'll come back to, and thousands of ostraca. And we'll also come back to the houses, as we see in more detail, as they survived until a century ago. And so the next case study from Turin, which I was really excited to see I've known about this text for a long time. In its 1912 publication, there's a lot of text on the slide. Again, it's just to give information about the document. But in its Editio Princeps by Krumme and Steindorf, Koptische Rechtskunde, it's noted as being in the Museo Egizio, but doesn't have an inventory number. And until I finally harassed Susanna Topfer for its catalogue and found it, I don't know how many people have worked on it, the actual physical copy, since 1912, when I believe Krumme at least would have seen it, but he may have been working off the edition by Francesco Rossi. This is one of over 100 Coptic legal documents, and we see from the size, this is 113 centimeters long. It's a really long document. It's not quite complete. 83 lines survive. At least I'd say 6 or 7 are lost from the beginning, so it'd be slightly longer still, but it's mostly intact. This corpus provides an incredible wealth of information about life in the village and surrounding communities in early Islamic Egypt. This particular document, being part of Drovetti's collection and so acquired in Thebes in the 1810s, I believe makes it the first Coptic papyrus from Djeme to have been acquired in the modern period. The largest collection of papyri from the site are today in the British Library, having been acquired by the British Museum. The earliest one in the British Museum is a single outlier in 1836. Most were acquired from the 1850s to 1906. And so this is at least 20 years earlier. The second largest collection is in Cairo, which is largely the same date as the London collection. And so whomever found it for Drovetti, we've lost the original context, but it is, and I'm 99% certain, the first Coptic document to have been removed from the village and sold. I won't be, as with the previous document, I won't be including any Coptic in it, but if people are interested in reading the text but don't have access to the original editions, I just want to flag up the Duke Databank of Documentary Papyri, available at papyri.info, which has the entire Coptic text provided. It doesn't have the translation, but for those familiar with Coptic, and if you've never read non-literary Coptic before, it may be a bit of a shock, as I think non-literary stuff always is. And one thing that I will be bringing to their attention soon is that the inventory number is not known. I just don't think people have bothered to ask before. So that information will be updated. And so what is this document? While the beginning is lost, from everything else that survives, we know that this is a deed of sale, and we can identify the two parties. The purchaser is one Appa Victor. Appa is a title commonly held by monks, but not only. And we have Appa Victor, the son of the late Athanasios, in Djeme, in the nome of the city Armont. So nomes are, well, in English, I'd refer to them as counties, whatever the Italian equivalent is. So I guess Piedmont and Djeme being, for tax purposes, located in Armont, ancient Greek Hamonthis. And the seller is a representative of the monastery of Apophoivamon, the monastery at Deir el-Bakri. Here, Johannes, the humblest presbyter, who elsewhere in the document also has the title hegemon. So we see here, it's not the only document to do this, but another document that links multiple sites and people. We have again the monastery at Deir el-Bakri interacting in social, legal, economic ways with villagers from Medinet Habu. And so in the proximity to Deir el-Bakri. But we're looking, and I'll refer to this again with other example I used at the very, very end briefly, at this really connected Western Theban landscape. Monastic communities are not isolated from the village. They interact not just in religious terms, but in very secular ways as well. Here, legal terms and concerning property. And so, to the points, for anyone who can read just cursive Coptic is the relevant section, but the key points across these lines are And what's quite unusual is that it's not just that the monastery is selling the property to Apophycta, it gives also how it acquired, the information about how it acquired the property. It was originally given to the monastery by a Georgios for the benefit of his mother's soul. And we see a couple of documents say this, that property is sold for the funerary remembrance of the deceased, so to have prayers and so on and so forth given after the deceased's death. The monastery is now selling on the properties. It doesn't say why. Maybe it needed hard cash rather than any other, maybe more minor revenue from owning these properties. And it's a large list of properties or shares in properties that the document mentions. Shares in a house. The village was so busy at this time that streets were named as well. And so we have a number of documents that refer to different streets, nearly always named by particular people. Here, Paneas, son of Fabo. Shares in a field, shares in a church. We have a couple of other examples of churches being sold, doesn't say which one. Shares in a courtyard and unspecified objects, all for the sum of 4 gold coins, the Coptic term holokotonos. And so in terms of the houses, while this document is slightly unusual that it doesn't specify which part of the house, what these legal documents do is to describe the houses so that you can identify them by their neighbors. So in the top right here, I have how the house is described by its 4 cardinal points. Nearly always by houses owned by other people, sometimes by streets, sometimes by other features. And so this would be knowable, right, to the local community. This would be an identifiable marker. And at the bottom right, we have drawings by Uwe Hoscher, who was there with the Chicago mission a century ago, based on his architectural survey of the remains, give an idea of what houses at this time looked like in terms of their floor plan. They had basements and normally a couple of stories as well. And across all of the deeds of sale and other legal documents we have, for example, settlements of dispute, we know that sometimes people sold single rooms in houses. Sometimes a collection of different rooms on different parts of the house, sometimes entire houses. So this is not uncommon in and of itself, like these bigger houses, I guess, parceled up into almost flats, apartments, to be anachronistic. And so we have all this information about the urban makeup of the village, and sometimes we can pinpoint where some people lived. Oops, jumping ahead. In House 34, for example, I will learn not to be indelicate with the Mac. In House 34 is a rare example of text being found in situ. An amphora was found containing a number of ostraca which record the business dealings of a woman, Koloje, who was a moneylender in the village, and her work has been published by Women of Djeme by Terry Wolfong, that I'll return to later. But these legal documents as well, and this is one of my personal interests, again, going back to the more physical features of the text, like how much we learn, not just from what it says, but also other features. And here we have the very end of the document, which bears the list of the names of individuals who witness this text. So we have 4 men, Pushere, son of Petros, Constantine, son of Solomon, Psate, son of Pilis, and Pahash, son of Elias. And I've numbered them there. And the scribe who wrote the document writes at the end, his name is Jeremiah, son of Athanasios, and he also writes for a couple of the witnesses themselves. And so on one hand, we get a prosopography, right? We can populate the village. We know names of people who lived there, we know their relations, sometimes we know their occupations, we know their networks, how they moved, who signs documents, who do you ask, but also literacy levels. If we look, hand number 3 here is not very confident. You know, this is someone who can write a little bit, can sign a name, his name, but maybe do little text. But you don't have to be a professional to witness documents. You just have to be right just enough. And this is something that really interests me, getting down to this. And what we can see when we look at enough documents is how people improve across their lives in terms of their handwriting. And Jeremiah's here is an excellent example, and one without seeing the Turin document now I wouldn't be able to talk about. But here is another papyrus document that he wrote, today in the British Library, originally British Museum. This one is complete. At the top, we have this big protocol written in Greek and Arabic script, which is basically the label for when the papyrus roll was manufactured. It gives the date when the papyrus roll was made. And then the document starts underneath. And what the British Museum did, which Turin didn't, is cut their papyri in half, or thirds sometimes, as you can see from this wavy line at the bottom. Which is this modern cut, which Turin thankfully hasn't done, so you get really to see the size of these objects. And these both written by Jeremias, and I've taken out extracts there of his signature. The bottom one is in the Turin document, the one above it is in the British Library, the London document. And the top one, to pull no punches, is a bit of a mess. He's unconfident, it's uneven, he's made mistakes, he corrects the mistakes. He writes his name, the son of the late, and he forgets his father's name, adds it in. It's uneven, but by the time he gets to the Turin document, it's maybe not the most polished, most expertise, but it's much more confident. And this isn't just a case of, okay, fine, so he got better. One, it says that in the early ones, you don't have to be the world's most beautiful writer to write entire legal documents. You have to be able to do it, and it calls into question questions about professionalism of the scribal practice and so on. We won't get into that. But in practical terms, it means you can date these two documents relatively against each other. They don't have absolute dates in these. They've generally been dated, as a lot of them are, to maybe the mid-8th century or the second quarter of the 8th century. But we can say confidently that the Turin text is later than the London text. And that is no small point, but it's a point you can only come to when, again, you look at the originals. And so I mentioned Terry's book a few times, Wonderful Introduction to Life in the Village. My work is much more focused on scribes and writing and what we learn from different perspectives. And while I'm largely done, I just wanted to mention work being done by other colleagues currently on material in the Turin collection. And that is the group of 76 ostraca in Turin, the result of the excavations of Ernesto Schiaparelli at Dera Rumi, which lies at the entrance to the Valley of the Queens. My colleagues Matthias Müller, Claudia Gamma, and Heike Belmer, who are working on this, and an example of a recent article by Matthias Müller on preliminary observations on this material. And why I wanted to mention this, not just because of promoting other work being done currently on unpublished Turin material and by colleagues, but also this also shows networks and movements across Thebes. In here, this case, the monk Andreas, son of Petros, who's well attested at Dera Rumi, and what we see is his business letters and how seemingly his life at the village, when he decides to become a monk, he takes his personal archive with him as well and goes. So we see across a man's career and lifespan as he moves across Thebes. So they're highlighting with the arrow the location of those two sites. And again, just a really small number of examples I've shown this evening, but showing one, I hope, the wealth of other information and questions we can ask when we don't just rely on the printed edition of the text, but when we look at everything else and try and contextualize it in the archaeological landscape as well, but also how Thebes at this time in the 7th and 8th centuries must have been a really bustling and busy period of monastic communities of different sizes, of villages. We know Djeme, others, possibly in the Ramesseum, other sites that are lost, but the networks and how people move and interconnect, and we can tell it also by how texts move, by how material gets from one site to another. And just to round up, thanks again to ACME for the invitation. Thank you to Elisa Fanetti for facilitating my trip. And thank you to Susanna for answering my questions about the collection. And I just wanted to end that the past couple of years have been difficult for many reasons. But one thing they've shown is that before the pandemic, those of us who were fortunate to be able to travel could go and see objects in museums. And not everyone had that privilege, and the kind of work that I've spoken about and the kind of questions you can ask can only be done by seeing things. And so I just really wanted to also thank the museum for the work doing on its catalogue, which facilitates this work anywhere in the world that you have access to the internet, because the past 2 years have shown how fragile the ability and the privilege of traveling is. And so, in both Italian and English, as the two examples on screen show, the two texts that I spoke today. And that online aspect also leads me to not just thank everyone in the room here this evening, but also everyone, hopefully, who has joined in on YouTube, because I think also the pandemic has shown us how much we have the ability to reach out to people, not just in the room, but elsewhere as well. And so thank you to everybody listening, both in the room and wherever you may be listening to. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. That was incredible, rich, and well, really a journey through Thebes from Medinet Habu to Deir al-Bakri to Deir al-Rumi, and showing how much, how complex it is, and it has to be nowadays, to address the material, the written material culture, because it's not only what the text says, it's only, it was very learning to see your statistics about where is limestone, why do you have limestone, where is most likely to come from. So it poses a couple of questions for us concerning supposed provenance and what we have to do, but it was very nice to see the interaction between what the text says, the materiality, to try to reconstruct the prosopography, what we can learn about archaeology. Is always a bit difficult to see how much hosher has taken away and how much still remains there. I was in Medinet Habu last week. Nadine Miller and her husband have been taking care of what we could in the new pathway that they're building around Medinet Habu to see what kind of remains is there, and it still remains such an incredible site. To understand also in late antiquity what was going on, and we have learned how much it's useful to go back and excavate again with the knowledge that we have nowadays. So thank you so much for all the questions you have raised. There are not always answers to that, but it shows how it's important to go back to text. Are there any questions either here or online? I also look whether there are questions online. Yes, please. Would you mind coming here so that they can hear you online as well?
Thank you very much, of course, for your lecture, first of all. I was wondering about the ostracon that you were talking about. You argued that the assumption that Gilmore and Ray made, that it is simply a throwaway thing, is probably wrong. But have you any ideas, or do you have any suggestions, perhaps, rather, what then its function might have been? Was it part of this collection of administration in the monastery, or is there any other idea that you have about this? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was toying with that idea of why would you write this? And one suggestion is if these records go into a bigger record book, maybe on papyrus that is lost or some other medium. We see that in other respects. We have lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of tax receipts, which I know tax is not everyone's favorite topic. It's one of my favorite topics. Not necessarily the taxes I have to pay, but the taxes other people had to pay. And there we only have the ostraca, but from other sites we have tax registers. And so we're probably missing something in between. And that could be the case. I like to think that, I don't know, it comes to this question of even in a world which has low literacy rates, when writing is important what you choose to write, that maybe it's a personal record for him as well. You know, if I saw a solar eclipse, which I've never seen a full one, I'd probably tweet about it or something, and whether it could be a record like that or something that the monastery wants to preserve for later. And that's so hard because they don't explain. Yeah. I do like being slightly provocative and suggesting that it's then used as a model or school text because it's so unusual, practicing writing dates. I don't completely undermine its value for solar eclipse, but you know, if it's got this use for dates and also the administrative notes, on the back. So if I was going to really play devil's advocate, I'd undermine it completely as a record and as a later text. But I think if you can found the suggestions based on the other material we have and make them plausible, then we can push boundaries a little bit as well. Which doesn't really answer the question. Who knows? I think is the short answer. But I think, I think what they'd like to see is that it's an aid memoir which gets written then into a longer permanent logbook.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, Susanna, please come here.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Actually, first of all, would you please fill in our database with all the dates, because I think this would be really useful. No, actually, I would have a question for the materiality, because you're very interested in this, as I am. Because when I saw the British Library papyrus and our papyrus, I was wondering a little bit about the quality of the papyrus itself, so the support. Because, I mean, we do not have that many documentary or administrative papyri, Coptic papyri, because our focus is more on religious papyri. Because seeing this actually looks really like a good quality papyrus. And as you know, I mean, seeing our collection, normally our Coptic material, the papyrus support is very thick, is actually not of high quality. But seeing those very long documents, I mean, nearly 100 centimeters long, it seems to me that they are really of a different kind of quality. So my question, first of all, is, I mean, is this just because I'm not so familiar with this material, so this is common that you have long documents of this high quality, or, I mean, I'm not sure how many palimpsest papyri are attested, because, I mean, knowing this kind of quality, I know this from the earlier period. So this means that my question also would be, could it be that, I'm just talking about the papyrus support as it is, that is actually reused manuscript, and also, I mean, having a look on the kind of cheat joint, the kind of production, this looks for me not really typical for the Byzantic period. But as I said, I'm not very well familiar with this material, but at least it was very something which was interested me.
Bunch of different questions. A number of them interest me as well. Thank you, Susanna. I think in terms of quality, it's very hard when working with mounted papyrus to see what the quality is as well. It's not as fine as Pharaonic papyrus. It is thicker. You often see splits in the papyrus as well. You see the fibers a lot. It's quite thick. What's really interesting, the palimpsest question, I've written about this. So the label that's at the top, what's also interesting is the fibers go at 90 degrees to the other text. At Thebes, at Djeme, these are never cut off and reused. I can't think of an example. We have a couple of documents that are reused, but they're very, very small in number. And the use of papyrus, I'll just go back to the Turin one, is actually quite wasteful. So this entire bottom, almost quarter, at least a fifth, 20% of this papyrus is empty, completely empty. It's not been cut off and reused elsewhere. In other sites, for example, Barit, a monastery near El Ashmunain, up in the Hermopolite Nome, which has been one of the best attested Coptic monasteries, and especially in terms of non-literary texts, they reused the use protocol. So other sites are reusing it and making much greater reuse of papyrus. But if Thebes have these legal documents, either papyrus is not as expensive as maybe we think, or there's a few people who can afford a lot of it and don't care for cutting off the ends and reusing it. It's a question that interests me about, like, who provides it, what's the cost, and those kind of questions we have missing. But in terms of palimpsest, there are not as many. They're really small in number compared to the number of papyrus documents that we have from Thebes and compared to other sites. And yeah, I think the quality is it's quite thick. They just survive really well, and I presume that's because of how either they were deposited in family archives or other depositories as well, and then have withstood the test of time. Not everything is as beautiful as these. I've managed to show 2 are very well preserved. We do have more fragmentary pieces, but Thebes is also exceptional for how well preserved a lot of really long documents are.
Well, thank you so much for coming here, and I was thinking that you have to come back soon, and we need your expertise in helping us out with our documents. So thank you again for traveling to Turin and for talking about such interesting text, and thank you all for listening, and also for those who are online, and well, we wish you to see you back here soon. Thank you.
I very much hope to be back soon. Thank you, everyone.